Hi everybody, welcome to today's interview. I'm so super stoked today to be chatting with Jenny Valentish. Jenny Valentish is the author of acclaimed publication Woman of Substances, and this is a book that is now often used in universities as recommended reading in the study of addiction. But it was Jenny's second book, Everything Harder Than Everyone Else, that caught my attention and brought her to my awareness. So we'll chat more about that shortly. Jenny's a journalist and a regular contributor to The Guardian, Vice magazine, and Sydney Morning Herald, and she's a former NME columnist and editor of Time Out Melbourne. She's also a regular keynote speaker at many drug and alcohol conferences, bringing in her lived experience. What I didn't know until very recently is that Jenny grew up in Slough, which is just around the corner from where I grew up, but now she lives on the other side of the world in Australia, where she moved in 2006. Jenny, it's a real great pleasure to be chatting with you here today.
You too. What a great intro. Thanks. Yeah, we've been chatting a little bit on Instagram over the past few months and checking each other out and what we do, and lots of
Yeah.
similarities. Yeah.
Yeah, so many. Actually, like I watch your fitness training at the moment and I'm just like, wow, and in a way that ties into some of the things that I want to cover today because it looks on some level as though you're going for that everything harder than everyone else kind of way of pushing your body, which is something that I relate to greatly. Maybe you relate.
Yeah. Yeah, the title Everything Harder Than Everyone Else, which is the title of a book I wrote about people who push their bodies to extremes. The idea of the title actually came from my addiction memoir, Woman of Substances. I think it was a line in there about me as a teenager and how I had to do everything harder than everyone else. That sense of bravado and needing to be first, and like your identity being tied up with this validation. And for some people it might be validation for gymnastics or something, but for me it was taking drugs before everyone else, and whatever else I could think of that was a bit edgy. So yes, I completely borrowed the title from Woman of Substances, and I think I still relate.
Well, I know I do, but like what's interesting to me is like listening to that you've just said. It sounds like we came into our stories from different approaches. So I get the impression from what you said there about, perhaps you were in your teenage years and you were wanting to explore drugs and you were wanting to explore, excess and hedonism. And I was actually the opposite as a teenager. I was quite a kind of sweet, good girl, but I was so horribly repressed, in particular by my father, and not given any freedoms and not given any trust, that in the end I just started falling in with the kind of crowd in Manchester that were edgy and bad and dangerous, and kind of getting attracted to guys that were sort of really not good for me at all, and found my way into my own story of addiction through suffering, through wanting to alleviate the emotional and mental pain that I then found myself in, whereas yours sounds like it was much more of an exploration of that kind of freedom of what's possible. Is that accurate?
Actually, no, it's more like yours, but just earlier, because I had really strict parents.
Right.
Well, dad was from a long line of policemen, and he was quite intimidating. So he wasn't that hands-on as a parent, but you, at the same time, towed the line when he was around. And mum was actually really super strict. And the more I sort of played up a bit or acted out, the more I was punished and put on like long contracts and things like that, like literally like 5-page contracts, to sort of monitor my behavior. So I was definitely pushing back a lot against that. And sometimes when I see friends of mine really hover over their teenagers or worry obsessively because they've found a drug, feel this kind of horrible deja vu, like, oh, please don't push them away.
Yeah.
If it's persistent
Yeah.
and there's no kind of room for this fully formed human being to spread their wings and discover who they are, then they have no choice but to push back, as
Yeah.
you know.
Absolutely. And, as a mother of three, I'm absolutely astonished that my children have all come out so healthy and well in many ways. And I'm aware that there's an awful lot that I haven't seen and don't know about what they've done, which is natural and normal and healthy, that teenagers, as they find their identity, are pushing
Yeah.
back and questioning and rebelling, and I've had recent conversations with my son who I was supporting through surgery, and he was like, Mum, it's probably a good job that you don't know the half of what I've done, and it's probably a good job that I've had this shoulder injury and not been able to do a lot of things that I want to do, many of which are focused around what's covered in your book, actually, because he's got a penchant for extreme sports and a desire to do extreme things. And I'm kind of like, so that's another angle for me of what called me into wanting to know more about why people might do those things, because I know how that showed up in my story. So I'm curious, before we come to, anything more about my son, don't necessarily want to talk about him here, but like how that showed up in your story, that you went on your journey through, because it sounds like you've had an incredible life. I mean, the bio that I've just read out, there is so much more on your website about who you've written for and what you've explored. Did you have clarity going through that, or did you get lost in that sometimes?
Sorry, in the path of.
Well, you had all these stories of writing for music journalism, and you had was it a book about being a groupie, or there was a title that you used, and I'm just like, oh, okay, what was going on there?
I knew from a very young age what I wanted to do. I used to like make little newspapers when I was 10 on the typewriter and things like that, and magazines. And so when I was 16, 17, I created a fanzine called Slapper, the Groupie's Guide to Gropable Bands. And it was because I realized even at that age, there's a lot of fanzines out there. Fanzine just being, cut and paste little self-published magazine. I need a point of difference. And so I gave it this angle, this hook, which was all these fictional characters in it who were groupies. I was very influenced by Pamela de Bar and the GTOs, who were this band of groupies in the 60s and 70s. So I created all these fictional characters and put out 4 or 5 episodes, and they all had themes, and I sold them in Tower Records and in the States and in record shops over here. But it did get me into trouble because some journalists deliberately kind of misconstrued it and decided to do this piece for a broadsheet, the Sunday Times, about how I was spearheading this new movement of middle-class groupies. So he interviewed me when I was 17, and then I was in like a full page in this broadsheet, the Sunday Observer, I'm sorry, with a picture of me with my spiky hair and fishnets surrounded by my fanzines. And I think the headline was "More Sex, Please, We're Groupies and Proud of It." And it was a complete stitch up because as I said, my parents were really strict, so I couldn't actually get out and do all the things that these fictional characters I was writing about were doing. But suddenly I was all over the newspapers, and my mum had to go out and buy every copy she could find, and so her friends in book group and things like that wouldn't see it. And from there, our house phone in Slough was ringing constantly with tabloids and TV wanting to speak to the groupie because it's just a nice salacious story. Yeah. And groupies didn't really well, they probably did exist, but they'd kind of gone out of fashion. So I think it was like, oh, good, we can reinvigorate that tired old trope.
Yeah.
So that was a really early exposure to, well, one, I knew exactly what I wanted to do, but it was also really early exposure to how the press can really stitch people up and how you have to be responsible, which was a good lesson given that I was going to be a journalist. So, I was reading things like The Enemy a lot of the time, and their whole modus operandi was to tear people, build people up, tear them down, be very sarcastic and kind of like ambush bands. And so I probably would have gone down that route if I hadn't had the experience of being stitched up like a kipper. So that was the beginning of my journalism career.
Wow, that's amazing, that because you knew what that felt like, that you didn't want to be a party to that. That's what I'm hearing anyway. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So I'm glad it happened, and I can laugh about it now. It was quite distressing at the time.
Yeah.
No, I just went on to get jobs at magazines, music magazines, so Guitar Magazine, and yeah, I had a column in the NME, which is really a kind of a techie column about how to play different songs. And then I moved to Australia and got jobs in men's magazines, women's magazines, Time Out, more music magazines. And now I'm freelance, mainly for The Guardian.
Are you a musician as well?
I was, yeah.
Right.
In London, I was in a few bands. I was in a surf band called the Depth of Beach Babes. So we wore leis and grass skirts, and in an indie band called Spy 51.
Amazing. Wow. Okay. God, you've definitely lived a life. I want to backtrack slightly. What was the impetus for you to move to Australia?
Probably escapism.
Right.
I in my 20s, I'd made quite a mess of my life, and even though London's a big place, it felt like I'd kind of burnt quite a lot of bridges through my drug and alcohol use and general behavior, really. So I moved to Australia, and that was just in 2002 originally for the old working holiday. But later I married an Australian and then another Australian. So I've had 2 Australian husbands.
And are you married to an Australian husband right now?
I am with an Australian right now, and
Yeah.
we've both decided, having been around the block, that we'll only get fake married. So we regularly get fake married and have our own ceremonies. And so far we've done it in Bali and Sicily, and we noticed both of them have an active volcano. So we're only ever going to get places with an active volcano. So it'd be like Hawaii, Iceland, New Zealand.
Amazing. I'm not sure what you're calling in there, but it's like, wow.
No, it's like tempting fate, isn't it?
But you know, I mean, I think life, you know, we'll talk a little bit about the path of addiction and the beautiful things that come from that, actually, or the strengths that come from that, because, you know, having just started diving into your book, Everything Harder Than Everyone Else, which I'm going to show people there, there is so much in there that I resonate with, because when I first, not immediately, because I went back to art school when I got myself out of addiction and got clean. But then I realized, because I went to work in a casino for a while thinking, oh yeah, you know, maybe that's going to be really super glamorous. And I rapidly realized it wasn't. And I thought, well, what can I do that's useful? So I applied for a job in a main drug support agency, one of the Lifeline, you might know it, in the UK. And they were doing some really seminal work at the time with harm reduction publications. And this job came up, and I'll never forget, this was before my father passed, and he said, well, don't get your hopes up, you're not likely to get a job like that. And I went in and I got the job based on my lived experience. And my employer at the time, who was the one that did a lot of the design, said, you know, when we employ former addicts, he said, there are some great skills and strengths that come from that. You know, one of them, he said, which is not always a great thing, is that a lot of addicts can almost be like Vietnam vets who are still in the cave with the guns pointing out, who haven't been told that the war's over, because they're on hypervigilance and hyper alert, because we train ourselves to see danger, because we have to see what's dangerous if we're in dangerous situations all the time. But that also can give us tremendous resilience and a capacity for being creative and problem solving. And that shows up in your book. So I want to just bring something in here, because I want to ask you, from that book and from your own lived experience, are there a set of things that you notice about people who push themselves so hard that they might not necessarily be all former addicts, but are they swapping one kind of addiction for another? You know, you talk about Charlie Engel in this early chapter of your book, and his story really moves me as well, because I relate to a lot of what he shares, although I'm far from an ultramarathon runner. What have you observed, and how does that relate to your own experience?
Yeah, there was I did notice when I was writing Women of Substances, because it was heavily researched, that for some reason, long distance running, it seems to be the most appealing sport to people who've quit drugs.
Right.
And there have actually been quite a lot of memoirs written by people about having, given up crack, say, for ultra running. I think it's because there's a huge element of self-flagellation. Of course, it's all about endurance. It's called endurance racing. And I think if I think back to my own drug taking, a lot of it was like testing your limits and endurance. So I think there are all these parallels. And it's about chasing a high and getting the feel-good chemicals when you reach a certain point of the sport. So I wasn't surprised really to notice those parallels. But in the book, each chapter looks at kind of a different type of extreme pursuit. So there's one on porn, but it's particularly sort of endurance record-breaking porn. There's one on BDSM, and there's deathmatch wrestling, which is where the wrestlers use weapons on each other, but it's choreographed, but they still get really hurt. There's bodybuilding, there's fighters, and I did find a commonality more often than not between the people, depending on what sport they were doing. So bodybuilders, for instance, is quite common because it's such an ordered sport. And I'm doing it now. But it's a sport that's all about counting macros. It's all about sets and reps and weighing yourself and getting up at 4 a.m. and really strictly structuring your day to get everything done. It's appealing to people who had the really kind of inconsistent parenting. So that might mean...
that's interesting.
Yeah, because it was chaotic for them. So that might mean, maybe a parent had drug issues or mental health issues, or there was just one parent and they couldn't give enough attention, but things were chaotic and unpredictable. And so bodybuilding offers this sense of order. And then with wrestling, it's like the pantomime of suffering, it's a larger than life pantomime of suffering, and it's being able to express yourself very, very loudly. So I found that each sport tended to attract people for different reasons, and that was really fascinating. And I had my parallel journey when I was writing it. I started training in Muay Thai, so kickboxing, at the beginning of the book, and by the end of the book, I was having fights. So it was, interviewing people, but also going through this journey of what does it take, and have I got it, and what does it mean to have it, and just trying to explore that personally.
What do you feel has been the most significant thing that you have observed in yourself from that journey?
Well, I knew I was very goal-oriented, but I learned about telic and atelic activities, and the ancient Greeks talked about them. So it's their Greek terms, but a few philosophers in the modern day have been talking about it again. And atelic activities, and I'll do it the other way around, telic activities have an endpoint. They're goal-based activities. So I'm going to go for this race, or I'm entering this prize, or I don't know, I'm making this thing to sell it, or I want to get this medal. Whereas atelic activities are things that have no endpoint. You just do it for the sheer enjoyment of it.
Right.
And maybe like an integrated breath practice. And I looked at my life and I thought, I have nothing like that. No atelic activities at all. Everything I do has to be to show off, to be validated, to have a purpose, to be seen.
Right.
So that's the biggest thing I learned about myself, that I need constant validation. I mean, it's quite a vulnerable thing saying that, but also a bit silly because most people do.
Yeah.
I just suppose it as a penny drop moment for myself.
Yeah.
We're all on social media, we're all posting shit. And artists don't tend to just paint and then stuff it under their bed. They want to sell it or display it, and musicians want to sell their albums.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just realized to the extent of how that was true to me. And also this book is there's quite a lot of books recently about people pushing themselves to extremes and exploring grit. So you've got things like Scott Carney's What Doesn't Kill Us, and Stealing Fire by Stephen Kotler and Jamie Will, and people are listening to Dan Huberman's Lab and, you know, Tim Ferriss, and like trying to become better versions of themselves. But this book's a bit different because it's more kind of acknowledging the monomaniacal side to people who engage in extreme things, and the novelty seeking and the impulsivity and the restlessness that drives them. And so at the beginning, I've got a quote from Carl Jung: "How can I be substantial if I do not cast a shadow?"
Yeah. Yeah, I noticed that, and that struck me straight away because, you know, I think there's so much resonance. I love that you observe that about yourself. I've never heard of telic and atelic activities, by the way. And I would say that for me recently, and I'm becoming a huge fan of the Huberman Lab podcast. And I also listen a lot to Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO podcast, which has more of a focus on the mental health and the challenges that people overcome.
Okay.
Really, really enjoy it. I'm familiar with Scott Carney's work because of his connection with Wim Hof.
Yeah.
And similarly, I'd say that for me at the moment, in wanting to become a better version of myself as I get older, because I have this theory that, you know, with my children, I say to them, I don't want you to be in a position where you have to look after me physically or mentally simply because I've neglected my own self-care. You know, if something happens and then you're called to do that, fine. You know, I'm sure all of us will make sacrifices as an act of love. But if it's through my own self-neglect, that doesn't feel good. And so I've started going regularly, almost every day of the week, actually, for sauna, followed by cold shower, sauna, cold shower, sauna, cold shower. And that's what you would call, I think, an atelic activity. Is it based on what you said? So it's not goal oriented, if I've got that the right way round. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. My boyfriend does that. He actually is lucky enough to work at the hot springs, Peninsula Hot Springs. He makes all their fitting, like, settings, beautiful place. But yeah, he does the ice bath and sauna, in and out, in and out, in and out. Although he has turned it into a telic activity because he's decided, you know, he's setting himself kind of goals and records, and he's measuring, you know, his blood pressure before and after. He does like a 3-month stint and all these other kind of readings in his body. So he's turned it into a mission.
Wow.
But whatever gets you doing things, I say.
Yeah. And I mean, you talk about the dopaminergic reward system in your book as well, and you know how lots of these activities are that kind of replacement. Again, I've come to this and I'm reading this and I relate enormously, because I think what I swapped my original addictions for was obsessive busyness, you know, just kind of being on the run almost all the time. You talked about leaving, you know, the UK for Australia and kind of like leaving because you'd burnt bridges. But for me also, there's been this sense of running from myself somehow. And I even got to the point where when I went to live in France many years ago, I changed my name completely by deed poll. And then I went to this family constellations event that was running, and I was curious about it all. And every person that sat down in the hot seat was asked the same question, which was, why are you here? So, of course, there was about 20 of us in the group, and I'd planned my response like we do when we're waiting for our turn. And I sat on the hot seat, and the woman, because you have to submit a little feedback form before you go into the group, and the woman who was running the space looked at it, and she said to me, as soon as I sat on the seat, what are you running away from? Oh my God. I mean, I flushed, I went bright red, I felt defensive, I felt exposed, I felt all these things. And it took me years to realize that that's what I was still doing in my obsessive busyness. If I'm not careful, I can still do that. And I think there's perhaps an acceptance, is there? Would you agree that, you know, when we know what our lived experience is and we're driven by things, that it's like, yeah, I'm hugely productive in life. I'm very entrepreneurial in life. I like new things. I like the energy that I get from creating new things. And then I might go, right, what's next? And look around. I've always given myself a hard time about that, but I think it's a huge part of who I am.
Yeah. So I have started jokingly calling myself a professional amateur because I keep taking things, especially sport lately, and doing it till like the lowest rung of amateur and then getting bored and ditching it for something else. And I was thinking, what's wrong with you? Why can't you keep going? You're enjoying that. But there is this element of, no, I've done it now, and zoom straight onto something else. And I thought, it doesn't matter, that's fine. Just do as many things as you want to do. You know, my old trainer was going, you're a jack of all trades and a master of none. I thought, well, at least I'm not bored, you know, and I'll never be bored. So, I mean, sometimes I beat myself up a bit, like, oh, you're just quitting because something got a bit too hard. So there's that conversation going on.
Yeah.
But I don't mind that my attention's yanked this way and that, especially if you're, you know, you're in the arts or, you know, media, then you have to keep launching like full focus into a project, and then it's done and you fucking forget about it and go straight into the next one. That's your job.
Yeah.
So it's not really surprising like that across every aspect of my life.
Yeah. And why bodybuilding and weight training now? Because I've really seen on your Instagram that there's a lot of focus on that, and it's impressive.
Yeah, well, the competition's in April, so I'm afraid there's going to be a hell of a lot more content where that came from. Because I can't just go to the gym or be fit. There's got to always be a goal or a mission attached to it, as we've just sort of been discussing. So
Yeah.
I'd done the Muay Thai fighting and I needed something else to keep me going. And I thought bodybuilding something that's really good for us women, actually.
Yeah.
It's you plod away on your own. Oh, you have a coach, but you know, if you're quite a solo person, and often we are as we get older as well, especially, it's something you just plow away at on your own. And it's of course really good for you to build up strength as you get older. And then I like the fish out of water element, in that I'm quite a tomboyish girl, but I'm going to have to be on stage in a sequined bikini and high heels, both of which I never wear. I actually literally just now posted a picture of me in a bikini, and I've never, ever done anything like that, or even been on a beach in a bikini. I always wear board shorts.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of like pushing myself into that uncomfortable zone now. And it'll be all like hair extensions and fake lashes, and I just love that, because it's just going to be a completely immersive experience. It's really weird, and I'll probably only do it once. And move on to something else odd.
Yeah, I noticed on your Instagram a post about the hair extensions, and I was like, oh, is that what everybody has to do in those competitions? And is that the kind of heightening of what people perceive as the femininity, alongside something that is such a contrast to that? Because it's not classic that women look like that in those bodybuilding competitions. They do, but in general they don't. So I find that a really interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah, well, I think because you get more muscular, the judges are keen, and often they're men, are keen to then see you kind of overcompensate by being feminine in other ways. And especially because you have to lose so much body fat, you get down
Yeah.
to, I don't know, like 10%. So your boobs go. So lots of people have fake ones, I don't. But
Yeah.
if not, you know, you have to make up for it in other ways. So, you know, it's all about, you're going to have extensions, you're going to have the nails, but also you got to remember you're on stage. And so if you think of stage makeup generally, you know, what actors wear or you wear on TV, it's got to be big and larger than life, and the whole thing's a pageant.
Yeah.
The men have to look really, really ridiculously buff and brown and wear little posing pants too, so it's not just the women.
Well, I've just started watching, I don't know, you've probably seen it, but I've just started watching that Physical 100 series on Netflix, which is based in South Korea, and it's like 100 people. Have you not seen it?
Good.
Highly recommend, because it's a theatre, and it's just this 100 of their greatest athletes in all different boxing, wrestling, MMA, and some of them are athletes in other areas. Like there's a very tall, slender, non-Korean basketball player who's now living over there. There are women in there, and they're all pitted in these strength challenges with themselves and against each other. And basically it's whittling it down to find the strongest person, regardless of gender, size and shape. So some of them will have agility on their side, for example. They might be small and wiry and very light, and then there's others that are like absolutely hench, and there's really famous MMA fighters within that culture, and probably wider actually if you're into MMA. I know
What was
my
it called?
son is. It's called Physical 100.
Did you say South or North Korea?
South Korea.
Right.
I
Okay.
think it's South Korea.
I was like, I can sort of see the North Koreans doing that, but not in an entertaining way.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. It's kind of, fairly repetitive, but see, I'm always interested in the ways that people challenge themselves. It's kind of when I first went to see Wim Hof, for example, let's bring it back to kind of, the crossovers in our fields. But when I first went to see Wim Hof, I've always had an absolute loathing of the cold. I'm one of these people who needs to be warm and cozy and sleeps with a hot water bottle. And I was like, oh, cold showers. No, why would people do that? Oh, ice baths. But of course, I saw that he was also doing breath work, slightly different to the type that I teach and different reasons. But we got to this event and I found that it was probably 75% very ripped men who were heavily invested in performance, and they were doing the breath. Sorry.
Hold their breath for the longest.
Yeah, and who could do the strongest one-arm press-ups and all of this. And I'd gone there with a preconceived idea that Wim Hof was a bit of a show pony and like, let's see what this is about. But actually, once I got there and he was bringing in kind of this message to the guys of like, don't be macho, don't think you're like me, don't push yourself unless you've trained for X, Y, Z, and listen to your body and what does your soul want. And he was bringing in these concepts that I just thought, wow, okay. I got in the ice bath. It was the first time I'd ever done it, and that's only about probably 5 years ago now. And I actually thought I wasn't going to do it, and I'd hate it. And I got in, and it was hard. But I went into this. I'd say this was definitely dopaminergic, but I went into this absolutely blissful space where I could have stayed in. And of course, he gets everybody out to keep people safe.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like there are so many ways that we can explore what our human capacity is and what we want to do. And I feel that there's also a huge amount. It's almost like the tip of the iceberg visual, that here's this stuff that we do in life, and here's all this other stuff that we're capable of. Why do some people push themselves to explore all the stuff that's below the surface so much more than others?
Sometimes there's been a defining incident, like giving up drugs, for instance, or a sudden realization life's too short because you've lost someone, or maybe sometimes it's just because you are in quite an alpha culture, whether it be work, friendship groups, and so there's a sort of a competitive pushing of yourself, and maybe you work with spreadsheets and data and to be able to actually do something that feels more primal is appealing. So I think all sorts of reasons, but also the idea of testing your mettle and wanting to prove yourself. I actually said before we started I wouldn't talk about trauma, but can often come from childhood trauma, where it's almost like Freud's kind of repetition compulsion, where you have to keep testing your ability to cope and to push through things. And so I think sometimes that's a reason that people put themselves physically in these positions.
Yeah, I think, in your book, you're theorizing, and it's often beyond theory, that physical focus can calm an overactive mind. These were some points that I extracted, that it can distract you from emotional pain, that the repetition compulsion that you've just talked about helps people relive that trauma, but in different and healthier ways that aren't still in there. And one thing that the Wim Hof and the ice bath does do, and that some forms of breathwork do, is create what we call hormetic stress. So in other words, we're getting the body used to adapting to stress in different ways, so that when we come into the environments that are truly stressful, because it's hard for most of us to avoid stress, it's hard for many of us to avoid traumatic situations coming our way, but we've developed resilience, or we've developed a capacity to self-regulate more.
Yeah. And I think often people might not realize what they're doing. Like they might not realize that they're testing themselves in this sense. The only person who I've talked to who said something quite literal about it was a boxer I know, and I'm not sure what had gone on in her childhood, but she'd alluded to things. And then she said, and now I regularly put myself in the ring in front of a crowd. There's a referee, but I know nobody's going to step in and help me. I mean, if you're knocked out, the referee, but everyone's basically there watching, and she's got to go through this ordeal, knowing that people will just stand by and watch. And so it was kind of like she realized it's mirroring what had gone on for her in childhood. And God, I found that really moving when she was telling me that. And she's just putting herself through it again and again, and she's realized that's what it is. Nobody's going to come and save you.
Wow. I guess, when you hear things like that, like you said, it is deeply, deeply moving. As if we're able to do that and not be in the position of disempowerment, as in, well, nobody's going to come and save me and sod that, and that's my lot, and that's what I'm dealing with, and I'm just repeating the story, then it's less helpful to somebody than it is to say, I'm doing this because I'm taking back my power, and I'm doing this because I love it, and I'm doing this because I feel good. Do you find that there's a whole range of those experiences in the people that you're talking to?
Yeah, I mean, some of the people in the book, what they do, it could be described as self-harm.
Yeah.
And if you think more literally of self-harm, when people who are in great emotional pain hurt themselves, it's again, I think, a regaining control over your own body. Often it's people who didn't have any autonomy over their body, whether it's through sexual abuse, sometimes medical procedures that you've had to undergo as a kid. And it's kind of this physical marking of your body is this kind of way of saying, well, it's mine. So I think people who I profiled in the book, like, maiming themselves on barbed wire and wrestling and hanging by flesh hooks and that kind of thing.
Which happens in indigenous cultures a lot as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I think it's a way of exploring that within a sort of safer context or within an adult context.
Mm. Mm, 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 mm. Do you feel that in this exploration, which sounds as though it's been across of both personal and professional, that you've learned a lot about yourself?
Yeah, I'm definitely a lot less hard on myself, having written Everything Harder Than Everyone Else, because I realized these people are my tribe, and I didn't realize I had a tribe because I'm, a bit of a lone wolf, but in the sense that they found sort of novel ways of channeling this endless restlessness. I call them the natural born leg jigglers, because everyone I interviewed, their leg was going, and so was mine. So they've got this sort of natural kind of agitation, whether they were born with it or sort of it grew along the way, and they found wonderful, outrageous things to do with it, and are now known for that, and enjoy it and enjoy the kudos it brings them. And to go back to Charlie Engel, who's the guy who plans these insane races around the world, he's 60 something now. He said to me, because he'd given it a lot of thought, he gets the same sense of validation and a kick out of telling people about what his latest race is going to involve, and they're like, oh my God, I'd never do that, as he did when he used to smoke huge amounts of crack, and the people he was smoking with would be like, whoa, steady on,
Yeah.
So it's kind of served a purpose, but in a more sort of noble, extravagant way. And it inspires other people.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. There's so much in this conversation. There's so many areas. When I first gave my son your book for Christmas, which I did as well, he opened it, looked at the chapter headings, and he was like, "Oh, flipping heck, Mum, BDSM and kink and porn and blah blah blah." And I hadn't even realised. And I was like, "Well, yeah, these are areas that people explore to see what extremes they can take themselves to," and I find it fascinating on so many levels.
Is kind of, exploring where hedonism ends and endurance begins. And I think that actually goes for both books. I think it goes for the addiction memoir as well.
Yeah.
Ends and endurance begin.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what are you doing now, Jenny? What's your main passion, and where can people find you if they want to know more? What would you like them to know about you?
Well, I'm deeply into podcasts. I absolutely love listening to them. I'm obsessive. So I'm making one with my boyfriend at the moment, Frank, called The Love Experiments, where we're keen to sort of keep our chemistry going, so it's for couples who want to, like we maintain mental health now and we maintain physical health, and that's accepted. That's something we need to do.
Yeah.
It's about maintaining a relationship, but in really kind of exciting and cool ways. So the episodes will be about that. It's not out yet, don't look. But if people follow me, I'd love that, and I'll follow them back. I'm mainly on Instagram, and so it's Jenny Valentish _public.
Yeah, I'm going to put the links for where you can find Jenny for her website and her Instagram just below this interview when it goes live. And as I say, highly recommended your work. I'm excited about your podcast because I'm a fairly recent convert to, I feel like, my personal attention span has been so hijacked by social media and the quick fixes. And then since I moved recently, like I've got really back into reading, and I'm hoovering up books, largely fiction, but also non-fiction. And then I'm finding now that's also shifted my capacity to just listen to a whole interview on a podcast. And so, yeah, massive fan like you of Huberman. Will definitely look out for yours. And you offer writing courses as well, is that right?
Yeah, I do. So I've actually had 4 books out, and been a journalist for 25 years and a magazine editor for 8. So I teach feature writing, but also memoir. And I do that. You can look at valentish.net, but I do it all online. And sometimes that would be in UK time zones, sometimes it'd be in Australia time zones. But I love teaching memoir in particular because people who are drawn to it often have put it aside, and you and I were talking about this earlier, for decades, and they keep returning to it. They go, oh no, I can't. And they often come from families where they've been censored, or they felt censored or silenced, and they wind up being these kind of truth tellers. It all just has to come out in the end. And so I'm kind of guiding them through that. Also in very practical ways, like how to actually shape and structure your story, and not just vomit it all onto a page.
Well, thank you so much. And like, I see myself in that because that's what I've been my whole life. Like, one of my core values has been truth and integrity. And like, I've felt this compulsion, and I've always had this sense of justice. I really relate to what you shared about the female boxer or wrestler before, and just that kind of way in which we kind of know when something is wrong in life, or we know when we're really being silenced or things are being covered up, and then it becomes this mission. I definitely like to write my memoir. I'm being told so often to do that, so I will be heading your way because I really relate to the fresh sense of like aliveness and spirit that you bring to your work. I'm grateful you've inspired me in this. I'm not sure I'd go so far as to get in a sequin bikini with high heels, but I am interested in fitness more and more these days, as my friends and followers will attest to.
Yes, I mean, I wish we'd been able to meet when I was in the UK. Actually, I'll be back
Yay.
in May, June. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Go
Oh,
twice a year.
say again.
Go back twice a year.
Right, okay. Well, if you're here and you're here for any length of time, it would be so amazing to coordinate putting something on, or a talk, or anything really, because I think, so
Yeah.
many people want to live bigger lives than they're living, and want to maintain that sense of inspiration and fueling their lives with good things that you're talking about doing with your podcast with your partner. It can apply to love, romance, work, health, anything really. It's like, how do we keep refreshing our capacity for expansion and exploration and greatness, which I think is what this human experience is all about.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jenny. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you and to give people an introduction to your work. I highly recommend that you go out and find Jenny's books and her website. I did just notice that you said jennyvalentish.net, and I've found one that's jennyvalentish.com. Are there two different websites?
Yeah. It's jennyvalentish.com is my journalism work, and
Yeah.
valentish.net is where all the teaching services are. Just
Amazing.
Valentish.
All right then. So if you send those to me, I will put them in the episode links for this YouTube
Thank you.
interview, and really look forward to seeing. Keep me posted on how you get on in the competition. I hope your hand makes a swift recovery.
Oh, so it would just be just before I come to the UK, so I'll be refeeding when I get to the UK.
Yeah.
Definitely trying to get some calories back in. So
Well, I salute your devotion, Jenny.
thank you very much. You too.
Yeah. Thank you for your